And the feminists have really taken over colleges. I mean, there's a lot of feminists in top administrative positions. There's huge women's studies departments. I mean, maybe you could claim, 40 years ago that this was a minority view that needed protection, but now on college campuses, it's the dominant view.
Absolutely. It's ridiculous. Some will say, oh, well, isn't it good that we have a radical vanguard, sort of people out there on the periphery with wild ideas? And I'm willing to say that's often good. But that doesn't describe what's happening now. They're the insiders. I'm very much the outsider. And any critic is automatically consigned to the periphery because they, as I said, they have a word for you, which is backlasher.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just that you're in the periphery where you're unimportant, but I mean, you've gotten into some trouble on college campuses. You said once you needed police protecting you because of messages you've gotten.
Yes, I think the administrators at Oberlin and Georgetown, this was last year, became very concerned because of the frantic and sort of wild Facebook postings before I came to campus, and decided that I needed a police escort at Oberlin. And I mean, I don't feel that I did. The kids didn't seem violent, but they were rowdy. They were angry. The first two rows were filled with young women who had tape on their mouths. They taped their mouths shut. I don't know what that meant. I should have asked. I should have taken a picture. Fortunately, there were a lot of pictures of the antics, and they set up a safe space where people could flee if they were triggered by my comments. And 30 students and a therapy dog fled to a safe room.
Do you think that the students really needed a safe space?
No, that's ridiculous. You can't. If you go to college, the idea of having to be protected from ideas is ridiculous. I mean, stipulate there may be. No, I'm not going to stipulate it. It cannot be. There can't be someone frightened of a philosophy professor. It doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. But it's not about protecting fragile people. It's a means of shutting down debate. It's a means of, it's psychodrama and coercion, I think.
Yeah. What really scares me is I think there's some people, I don't know the term, the radical left or whatever, who are going to try to get around the First Amendment by declaring views they don't like as either hate speech or sexual harassment or racial harassment. And they'll claim that it's not just speech, you're imposing this massive psychological harm on me. So that's why you shouldn't be allowed to say this anywhere near me.
I know, and they've turned it into an issue of safety.
Yeah.
And that's very new. There's all sorts of inventive arguments for shutting down free speech and free expression, but this one's new. And I think it's unnerving for administrators because they're risk averse and fear litigation. And now, of course, I think a lot of this was triggered, to use the word, by the U.S. Department of Education sending out that Dear Colleague letter in 2011, mm-hmm. reading colleges the Riot Act about harassment and sexual predation, and warning them that if they didn't take complaints seriously, they could lose their funding. Now, I can understand the Department of Education being alarmed if schools weren't protecting students from serious crimes like sexual assault, but the way they wrote the letter, it made it seem as if anybody made any comment of a sexual nature that upset someone, that would be considered harassment. That's not a legal definition of harassment. I mean, that's not actionable. That if a student tells an off-color joke and another student hears it and so forth, but the schools have interpreted it that way. And I think that mentality of, hyper-protectiveness of students from something that upsets them about, something that's related to sexuality, I think they've expanded it now, even something that upsets them politically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course you can always claim if you're upset by something politically that it upset you because of your race or identity or something.
Always. It's a very useful device for, again, for just closing down, any kind of normal exchange of ideas on a range of issues. Yeah, as you say, around race and class and gender.
It's weird. I mean, now with high-speed internet access, so many college students are exposed to massive amounts of hardcore internet pornography and probably just accept those images as normal. But yet when they interact, on the campus with other students, they have to act like they're Victorian gentlemen or something, or they can get in massive amounts of trouble.
Well, it's very odd because if the colleges had decided, all right, we're going to restore decorous politesse and everyone will behave, according to the dictates of what was her name? There was a famous expert on politeness. I can't remember her name, but let's say Miss Manners.
Mm-hmm.
There was someone before Miss Manners. But this isn't about manners. I mean, it's really because it does have a political tinge to it. If anyone's conservative, that tends to be considered, if you say anything, you could be called a bully.
What do you think can be done about this?
It's very worrisome. People think that there are conservatives on campus who are going to speak out. There aren't very many. So it's going to have to be liberals. And liberals have not, there are still a lot of liberals, old-fashioned liberals. Probably the majority of professors strongly believe in free speech and free expression and due process, but they don't speak out. And that's a problem because they're going to have to solve the problem, or the students are going to have to. But I don't know. I mean, just yesterday I heard that I think it was the soccer team, the male soccer team at Harvard, in 2012, they started this among themselves on Facebook, not on Facebook, but some private email. They were evaluating and rating the looks of the female soccer team. And now, evaluating members of the opposite sex is something both sexes have been known to do.
Yes.
But I can imagine, 18, 19-year-old, 20-year-old boys having fun, talking about these girls. Some of the language was explicit. Okay. Had I been, the soccer coach, I mean, I don't know that I would have said anything because I'm just not sure it's such a terrible thing to have done. But all right, tell them to apologize if the girls found out and they were offended. The team has been, they were about, I think, poised to win the championship. They've been suspended and they cannot play. I mean, sort of the most serious punishment short of being disbanded, and all because of this. And so what I see also happening is a kind of policing of male sexuality on campus. There was a time where it might have been gay students who would be in trouble, a long time ago, but now it's free, sort of open season on the sexuality of heteronormative males.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if a man offends a woman the way he asked her out, even if he asked her out in a very polite way, that can be a form of sexual harassment. Anything
that makes her feel, unhappy, or it's feelings based. Mm-hmm. And again, it goes back to this new regime where they sort of weaponized the feelings of the most hypersensitive people on campus. And people whose feelings can be driven by their politics.
Maybe this is all a very clever plan by websites like Tinder to force everyone just to date on Tinder, where you never find out if the other person likes you unless you like them first, so you don't have to worry about rejection.
I feel sorry for boys because they do have to initiate. It's still the tradition, and there's no evidence that has changed. There's no evidence males or females want it to change. That is what happens, is the males usually are, initiate, and they, it was always risky. They can be slapped down, but now they can be slapped down and brought up on charges. So,
yeah, I teach game theory, and I often talk about dating. And one year a student said something very interesting. She said that sometimes she'll get insulted if a very unattractive man asks her out, because he's saying that he thinks, I think you're in my league. But if that lowers her opinion of herself, it makes her feel worse about herself. Now, she wasn't saying that guy should be punished, but that sort of made a lot of sense, that one of the ways you can be offended by someone, asking you on a date is to say, wait a minute, this guy should realize I'm way above him. He doesn't. I feel awful. That's sexual
Yeah.
harassment.
Yeah. It's complicated, people. But to now put all of this under the, to let the deans and now an increasingly uh, uh, numerous group of gender operatics on campus monitoring these complicated interchanges. It's bound to go badly, and it has. We have countless numbers of young men who've been brought up on ludicrous charges, taken through what looked to me like kangaroo courts, thrown out of school as with sexual predator stamped on their permanent record.
Yeah, and they're changing the standards of proof, aren't they, for what it...
Oh, they've lowered it to preponderance of evidence. If there's more than a 50% chance it happened, then you rule against him. Now, if you add to this another new definition, which is they're now calling it sexual assault on some campuses, if two people have sex and they've been drinking. And so I was once in a debate about these changes with a professor at the University of Virginia, and I said, but what if they've both been drinking the same amount? No one forced anyone. They just had drinks. Would you say they raped each other? Could it be possible? And she said yes. So I find it all ridiculous and actually terrible for victims of sexual violence, because they need good research, they need good definitions, because that's the only way we'll find good policies and find ways to protect people. Mm-hmm. But that's not the direction we're going. It's more about policing male sexuality.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about some men have suggested a counter strategy would be for men to act as if this wasn't supposed to be just one-sided. I mean, the rules have to be written so they're gender neutral. So, men, if they overhear women saying something sexual, they file the complaint, just to put the colleges in a difficult position.
Oh, you're going to see more of that. There was already one case I read about, and I often feel sorry for the guys. I felt sorry for this young woman, and she was brought up on charges and humiliated, and she was forward. She, with this boy, and kind of came onto him or some, I don't know, I won't go into the details, but it was this human situation. It was complicated, and they were both drinking. If you want to stop all of this, then you have to do something the colleges would be frightened to do, because kids wouldn't go there, is to do something about the binge drinking. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, drinking is very, very common on campuses, and colleges aren't willing to throw students out for that if they just drink, so they can't really deter students from drinking.
I don't think they should, but on the other hand, it's ridiculous not to admit there's a connection between bad behavior and drinking, and foolish behavior and miscommunication. That is most of what the alleged rape culture is. It's miscommunication, regrets, bad judgment, bad hookups. Yeah. And so mixed with some genuine, situations of genuine crimes. I mean, it's just, but for the most part, at least from the best research that I've seen, it looks as though that's what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, college campuses mostly are relatively safe compared to the rest of America, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And it's ridiculous to say that as they do, people claim regularly that it's the most dangerous places for a young woman on college campus. It's actually, depends on the campus, but for the most part, it's the safest place.
And I imagine, the rhetoric about some people claim 1 in 5 women in college will be raped. If people don't know about colleges and they really think that's true, then you definitely don't go to college if you're a woman. You certainly don't let your daughter go to a college where she has a 1 in 5 chance of being raped.
What parent would send a child to such a place? But that figure would mean that we were as dangerous as, war-torn Congo or something.
Yeah.
And it's an exaggeration. But as we said in the beginning, the gender scholars are very powerful, and they have created these studies, and others are now replicating them by using their methods. And the method is you ask a non-representative sample of students vaguely worded questions, or a mix of straightforward and vaguely worded questions, and you will get an epidemic if you want, if that's your goal.
Is there any way to fight back against this? I mean, if you try, you'll be accused of like being pro-rape. So it's
I know you risk being called a rape apologist, which is
yeah,
a
it's a
horrible thing to be.
right. It's
But it doesn't take much to earn that epithet. So I'm, they've called me that because I've questioned the statistics. But I have this series, The Factual Feminist. I make videos and I correct feminist myths. If there were myths on the other side, if I saw men's groups making all sorts of false statistical claims about women, I wouldn't like that either. But I don't see that, and there may be some men's groups that do that, but they don't get put in textbooks and repeated by journalists. These do. The feminist myths are everywhere.
And one of the other myths is that women like never ever lie about rape, which means if you only need to show preponderance of evidence, then a guy being accused on campus, if you start with the prior belief that women never lie or almost never lie, then he would almost need video evidence that rape didn't occur.
Exactly. So, that's right. And there are committees. I've seen materials on campus where the tribunal that's selected to evaluate, to rule on a rape case, they're given materials and they're given all these statistics. They're told, that 1 in 5 women is raped, and that there's a statistic that only 2% of rape claims are false. Where did that come from? How would anyone know that? What do they even mean by a rape claim? And what does it mean to be proven false? I mean, all of these, there are many, many different answers to those questions. This was, I think it was from a book by Susan Brownmiller in the 1970s. And I'm not sure she had a source for it, but there is no source for that claim. But committees on our campuses today hear that statistic.
Yeah. And fewer college students are men. The percent of men in college keeps going down. Do you think this might be playing a role, that men are looking at this if they're on the margin and like, why would I take a chance in going to such an environment?
Well, I think what happened is the schools became more and more female dominated. And there are more young women on campus. There are more women in the administration, and certainly the gender studies, as you said, feminist theorists throughout the campus. So you have a very vocal group, and some have said we're getting what they call a pink police state.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's like the people want to have power, want to be able to control and destroy other people's lives.
See, this is the thing I don't understand. I was a feminist and still am. In the 70s, when I became a feminist, I didn't want to destroy anybody's life. It was about emancipation. It was a positive thing. And it wasn't about hurting people gratuitously or being snarky and angry and aggrieved and this whole thing. It's the opposite of liberation. It's repressive. And again, that's why I reject the idea that this is some kind of exciting revolutionary, a group that is at the forefront of a revolution. I don't see that. I see it as reactionary through and through.
What would you do? Imagine a Republican governor like Scott Walker from Wisconsin said, I want to stop this craziness. I basically have control over the Wisconsin colleges, the Wisconsin state colleges. What do you suggest I do? Do you think I should mandate that women's studies departments like hire at least 10% conservatives?
He can't do that. I mean, there's academic freedom. You can't.
Well, he probably could. It's not a constitutional idea. He could probably, he could just say, I'll defund the women's studies department unless you show more ideological diversity. He might not want to. It might be a bad idea. But I imagine, or he could take hiring authority away from them. He could say, you know what, why don't you pick the next 10 professors from the women's studies department?
I mean, I could see how he could do it if he had some cooperation with deans and with department chairs, because then you can control the money for hiring. You don't say, this is the way the feminists did it. They typically didn't say, you can't hire men, but they'd say, we'll fund a chair for a woman, or they'll say yes if you come to them with a female candidate. And you can have those sorts of things, but you have to have cooperation, or it will be seen as Oh my goodness, the uproar would be endless. The
But
protest.
would that be a bad thing? I mean, it's really hard to get a job in the humanities and social sciences. So it wouldn't be like everyone would quit their job.
I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure how a governor could do it. I just remember that if I think there was some effort for a while in Colorado just to bring some intellectual diversity to campus, and the way the governor working with the board of trustees, some of I guess it was the University of Colorado, they did organize a program where they brought in more conservative speakers and professors. That's certainly possible. But I do think that libertarians, conservatives, and now mainstream liberals have to think about what's happened, because the campuses are becoming crazier and crazier. And it's not only the antics and the illiberalism, the content of the courses is troubling, because the students they're not studying basics, important things. The classes are carried away with odd agendas, obscure little topics treated, from a paranoid perspective. And whereas, they might not know the history of the United States. They might not know anything about the Renaissance. They might not know any of the Enlightenment philosophers, but they'll know all about women writers in the Oklahoma Panhandle.
Is this kind of propaganda filtering down to pre-college education?
Oh, yes. I just spoke at Columbia, and a lot of students, and yeah, it was mainly students, recent students, but they told me that they had been getting this stuff, this gender propaganda, since kindergarten. And they'd been going to these posh private schools in New York City, and they get it year after year after year. And then some of them found the factual feminists and said, oh my goodness, because they know, they have to know, every, I would say, healthy person knows that some of these, for example, they'll learn if this teacher, the high school teacher, takes this intersectional approach, it presumes that the United States is racist, white supremacist, colonialist, imperialist, and patriarchal. None of those things are true, or it's just not accurate. There are many, many faults with this country, but to call it white supremacist seems odd, and to call it imperialist, compared to what exactly, and what do they mean? But they learn that. They have this sort of Howard Zinn view of American history. And so and this is done in elementary private schools, and as early as, the early grades, this paranoid view of their own society.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're recording this show a few days before the presidential election, and right now Donald Trump has about a 35% chance of winning. Do you think Trump's success is in part due to a backlash to all of this?
I think it's part of it, because it's hard to know. There are many analyses, and I've given up. I worry very much about him winning. I think he's too unstable. Hillary Clinton is, I like the idea of a woman president. I just wish it were a different woman. But the fact that I have to vote for her is so alarming. But I do, because he's just too unhinged. Mm-hmm. But the popularity is partly because I think there are many people that are so, first of all, just what I was saying is calling the United States white supremacist, or take every other Republican, Romney and John McCain, the left used extreme language to talk about them. Mm-hmm. And so now in conservative will hear them doing it about Trump and think it's the same old thing, just hyperbole, exaggeration, crying wolf, overstatement. And I think many people just they hear these stories about Trump, they think it's just a media spin, mm-hmm. and they can discount it. And often it is. It just, in this case, it's a lot of it's not really spin. He's really a worrisome character.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that propaganda, though, can work on a lot of people? Do you think the feminists are influencing public opinion out? Once the students leave college, you don't have to write what their professor wants to hear. Do you think they keep some of the views they had?
Oh, I do, because you imagine you're a sensitive young woman and you take these courses and you're told all of these things. You don't see it exactly. You don't see all of this violence and racism and predation, but you've been told that it's there. And then there's it's in the textbooks, and then you have a lot of in the blogs. It's Twitter hashtags. Everyone's telling stories about how awful things are out there, and you get a distorted view of reality, and it's reinforced over and over again. And anyone that comes along and says, "Well, this isn't true," they're called a crank, and so why would you question it? Now, it may be that when they get out into the real world, they'll just have to encounter and cope with reality and change their views. But I don't know. I'm worried that they're going to come and start changing the workplace the way they change the colleges.
Mm-hmm. Where people will be afraid to ask someone out on a date or to make a mild joke.
There'll be anonymous reporting, and people will be afraid to say anything. It's just so unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm especially worried that this is sort of degrading what we think of as truth. That if there's one big area where people who disagree with you are considered evil, you can apply that to everything else. And suddenly the idea of someone disagreeing with you because of your marketing analysis, well, they're just a bad person and they're doing it because of your gender or race or something.
Well, we see that. I mean, at first people were worried that with the internet, and people could have their own media and their own sources of information. And now it's almost as if you can have your own set of facts, mm-hmm. and you won't, you don't have to listen to anybody that has different facts. And everyone has to take into account confirmation bias. We all have it, and you have to be very careful and open to the possibility that you're wrong. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's key to being rational.
Yeah,
and it's hard. It's hard for everyone. But I think conservatives on campus, it's better. You're better because you are constantly challenged, and so you have to keep your arguments in good repair, and you have to be aware of the other side. But if you're a very left-wing student, you can go through now, I think, many colleges and never be exposed to a different point of view.
Mm-hmm. There's some evidence that women have actually become less happy since the 1950s. Do you think feminism, by creates sort of a negative placebo effect by saying all these things are horrible, you're being discriminated against, and this causes women to be less fulfilled with their lives?
Yeah, I haven't actually looked carefully at that data. I have seen that that's true, and I'm wondering if this, there's just a lot of divisiveness now and a kind of gender war mentality, and it doesn't seem to be very conducive to happiness. And I think that the women's movement did a good job in letting women know about the importance of careers. But for many women, there's pretty good evidence that they care about having family as much or more. They care about having children and husbands and so forth. And so that's all become more difficult for complicated reasons, not because of feminism, but feminism didn't attend to the problem. It's very good at, the current establishment is very good at telling you how to get an abortion or how to, demand daycare. But what if you want to stay with your child? And there's, we have good data from the Pew Research Center and from people like Catherine Hakim in England about women's preferences. And the majority do place more of a priority on home and family. And it's harder to get now than before. Most women have to work full time. And you don't see the women's movement viewing that as a hardship. They view it as victory. But what if it's not victory for everyone?
Well, what is the view to academic feminism to a woman who goes to college but then decides having a lot of kids is more important than a career?
Well, I mean, they will say, that's fine. We just want women to have choices. But it doesn't seem like that. If you look at the women's studies texts, as Christine Rosen is a historian in Washington, D.C., and she wrote an analysis of women's studies textbooks. I think she looked at the 5 or 6 leading textbooks. Now, this was a few years ago. Maybe it's changed for the better. I see no evidence of that, but maybe it has. But she found fairly negative attitudes about conventional marriage and motherhood. Mm-hmm. So I just don't see evidence that there's much support for those choices. And those, for many women, those would be more conducive to happiness.
Mm-hmm. One of the stranger views of academic feminism is that like all the differences we observe between boys and girls or men and women are like because of society, that genetics plays no role in different outcomes.
Yeah, that seems to me to be just scientifically, kind of scientific illiteracy, because if you study biology and look at the role of hormones and then just use the evidence of just common sense of men and women and how they differ. Well, they will always say, oh, well, that was because of the patriarchy and the social construction of gender. But we see similarities between, let's say, choices of toys. We see it, the boys tend to get towards gadgets and girls tend towards, caring play. We see that even in primates. There's similarities. So, is it a social construction if female, vervet monkeys want the females tend towards, playing with a little baby doll and the males go to a gadget? We see it. We also know that you can, even in animal studies, if you can see the effects of sort of male hormones. If you expose a female primate to male hormones, you'll increase aggression and diminish nurturing play. And we even have evidence in human beings. Mother Nature has provided a group of girls who have congenital adrenal hyperplasia. They were exposed to high levels of male hormones in the gestation period, and they play and have the same interests as boys, as children. They've been masculinized.
And there's difference of MRI scans of male and female brains.
Yeah, I don't know about those. See, the thing is, I'm always hesitant because there were a lot of initially there was a lot of excitement about the MRIs and showing all sorts of things, and now I think it's less certain. I mean, the social constructionists are right to say that we don't understand the brain and there is plasticity, so we have to hesitate. But they have to hesitate too, because to rush in and say it's all society. I think it's obviously a complicated mix of biology and an environment. And so what? Why this idea that we have to undo it and that the conventional preferences that they seem to think that they're toxic or something children have to be saved from. And children, typical little girls, not all little girls, typical little girls do enjoy nurturing play and theatrical, imaginative play, playing house, playing school. And the boys go for rough and tumble play on a typical little boy. Or if they have imaginative games, they're superheroes vanquishing enemies. And that seems to be just a part of their healthy development.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to get kids to enjoy doing something that they don't really enjoy doing. You can't really push someone to play with a toy they don't want to play with.
And what I find funny is in some of these, this was a school in Sweden, they wanted it to be gender neutral. They weren't going to even mention, they didn't call the kids boys and girls, they were just buddies, and all the toys were gender neutral. But they found they had to constantly police, especially the boys, because they would turn, sticks in the garden for tomatoes, and they would turn them into swords, and they would use the dolls as weapons. And so it took a lot of policing to liberate the children. And so I find it obviously ironic.
Yeah, on your factual feminist videos, you made a really interesting economic argument that the richer a society is, the more gender differences you might see in terms of life outcomes.
Yes, it's fascinating, and since I wrote about it, I've learned there are many other studies that show that the wealthier a society is, and the more educated, and just the very wealthy post-industrial egalitarian societies, there are more differences in male-female personalities than you find in, say, a rural society and a pre-industrial society. And they were so shocked, the researchers, to find this. But they hypothesized that in a society like the United States or Sweden or France, men and women have more opportunity for, self-development. So they become who they most want to be. And so you will find women indulging their inner femininity and men their masculinity, not because of oppression, but because of freedom.
Mm-hmm. So that's if being a computer scientist is the highest paying job. If you're really poor, of course you take it no matter what. But
Exactly.
As you get richer, you're like, well, I don't really find this interesting. I'm going to be a physical
You don't
therapist.
have to do it. And some of the gender activists in trying to get more women in STEM will say, oh, we're behind Mexico, and we're behind Pakistan, where women and doing information technology. Well, maybe it's that the women in Mexico have, because economics, they have to study engineering or computer science because they need to do something that guarantees a good income. In the United States, women study much more than men. They'll study anthropology, literature, completely impractical fields. You will find more women.
Mm-hmm. I remember a year or so ago, I had a student who was from Africa. She was from a poor family in Africa, and she was telling me, I can't possibly study art history. I want to become an investment banker, do something that earns a lot of money because I'm from a really poor family. Anything else would be irresponsible. And other people didn't understand that.
Right. So in the United States, you can see, well, what do people do? What do men and women do under conditions of freedom, prosperity? They can do what they want within, I don't want to exaggerate how well off everyone is, but look at some of the elite schools. Look at Princeton. And what you find is that there's just a huge difference in what they major in. In certain majors, the gender difference is extraordinary, like art history compared to, computer science or engineering.
How much of that do you think is due to genetics?
I think there's something to it. I think it has to do with preferences. And I think women are drawn to fields that they find, women care about they care about jobs, they care about pursuits that are personally fulfilling more than men do, that are can be a little more practical. Again, that could be necessity, but it's also, if you look at, I found it very interesting to look at the research that's done by experts on vocation, the people they bring into high schools or colleges to vocational psychology, what field should you go into? And they'll ask questions like, what would you rather do? Put a machine together, take it apart, put it together again, or would you rather talk to someone about their problems? And you just find a lot more, you find both men and women willing to do both, but you find a lot more men interested in that machine and a lot more women wanting to talk about problems. This is reflected in magazines. It's reflected in, what people do for entertainment. Men and women, you'll go broke trying to, have a gender neutral magazine. It can happen, but mostly they're not gender neutral. You'll find that they cater to one sex or the other because there's a difference in what interests people. And
this difference is probably hardwired into us.
I think there has to be something biological that might, one theory I've heard is, this was Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge University, that he has said that, for example, that children with autism, he said it might be the extreme male brain, because as we know, autistic children and autistic people have sometimes the high functioning autistics can have a fascination with systems and memorizing numbers but low affect and poor communication skills and low emotional intelligence, but sometimes genius level of mathematical ability and systematizing. And the suggestion was that maybe testosterone can in the masculinization process suppresses the emotional connection and increases the systematizing capacities. It's just a theory, but it does explain a lot the current sort of configuration of men and women in the workplace.
I have to imagine the autistic college student is going to be the one who's going to get in the most trouble with the gender police.
Actually, I have thought about that there could be one thing that could save some young men would be protecting people that are neuroatypical. If they count in the intersectional pyramid, or I guess it's a matrix of oppressed groups that are have to be respected and given a voice, and other people have to remain silent and check their privilege. But then and I've heard from young men who do suffer or would be on the Asperger spectrum somewhere, and they've told me that they have a problem and that they just don't know how to talk in the way that people expect them to, and they come off as being very blunt or rude, and they're worried about being accused of bullying someone.
I can certainly imagine, especially if you're asking someone on a date, and where most men could tell by your facial expression the answer is going to be no. So just pretend you're not asking her on a date. If you don't pick up on that kind of thing, you'll follow through and you'll insult her.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's
happened.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of the thesis that Larry Sommers got in big trouble for, that there's a higher variance in ability among men than women?
Yes, that's right. That's true. It's just true. If you get to give IQ tests, men and women, it's not the case that the average man is more intelligent than the average woman. So men shouldn't run off thinking they're superior. They're probably not. But at the very high end of the ability distribution, and people with freakishly high IQs, there are more men. It's something like 4 to 1. And but at the other extreme, you also will find more men. You'll find more men who are with learning disabilities and retardation. And so Mother Nature was fair in the sense that it's balanced, but it's also true that men appear to have better mathematical skills cross-culturally at the very high end, the highest performers in almost every country. There are only 1 or 2 exceptions. And those are always changing. So that may be just something local going on, but there seems to be an advantage for men in mathematics and women in the verbal skills. And in every country in the world, women are more literate and dominate in every country at the very high end in performance on skills in reading and writing.
I imagine in the next 10, 15 years, we will find out the genetic basis for intelligence. So a lot of these arguments will get resolved. People might ignore the results, but if you care, you'll probably be able to figure out what's happening.
Yeah, well, it's become so politicized. Let's hope that it gets sorted out. And so what? So if there's a difference between the sexes, I think that's a good thing. I just don't understand. But you see, they have conjured all these statistics about how horrible it is to be a woman, that you lose your self-esteem and you're going to be mistreated and cheated and you'll have an eating disorder and all that. But they've exaggerated these victim statistics. These are all problems, but I think they've been misunderstood and hyped up, and there's just too much spin. And overall, would I say it's better to be a man than a woman in American society? I would not. I think it's a complicated mix of benefits and burdens. You can't say who's better off. Both have huge advantages, both have disadvantages. And I wish we had a gender equality movement that was addressing the injustices or unfairnesses or whatever we want to call them for both sides, both sexes.
Although, I don't know, I think women on average have it better. If you look at life expectancy, that's probably the most important difference. And then rates of imprisonment.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I've always thought so. I mean, I never wanted and I mean, I never even thought boys were smarter until 12th grade. Then they began to show up. But before that, I just didn't. I never thought. I just didn't think that. But apparently, there's all this research that girls feel like shortchanged, and they're ignored in fourth and fifth grade. They just can't be true. They do so much better. They get better grades. The teachers like them better, and they're more likely to go to college. So,
could it be though in STEM classes that boys and girls respond differently to different material?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's one thing. If you want to interest girls in science, say engineering, something, you really do have to show them how it helps people in very concrete ways, and that will get their interest. But if it's just introduced sort of abstractly in a dry way, it won't. But it's the same with boys. If you want to interest them in literature, you probably have to have that be a field where they see themselves, they're competing, especially with other boys.
Mm.
And I think you get very high, amazing results in sort of the boys' public schools. They're called public schools, they're private schools. The elite schools in England, because they're all male schools and the boys are competing with each other to be literate, to be witty, to be erudite, and magnificent results. We end up having, so many of them come here and edit our magazines, the British Mail. The females are very good too, but the males, it's unusual to have the males with those little, and you also had it in Judaism, because you had the Talmudic training and the very high levels of verbal expression and argument. So it's very good when men are forced to do it, and they view it as an arena where they want to compete. But we don't do that in our public schools at all, and the boys they're way behind in literacy.
Yeah, that's certainly true. My 11-year-old son, he likes to win at everything. I mean, we'll go to watch a play, and there'll be like 3 different scenes, and they'll say, which scene was the best? Was mine the best? Did we win? That's what matters.
There was a school in West Virginia, a public school, but there had been a change in the education department provision, and you were allowed to experiment with single-sex classes. Mm-hmm. In this West Virginia school, maybe it was a whole school district, the boys were so far behind, they were desperate, so they had special classes for the boys and special classes for the girls. And they had something called Battle of the Books. And it was sort of like Jeopardy, and they have to read books and then answer questions. And the teams began competing more fiercely. And then the boys wanted extra reading over the summer. And the teacher said, I'd never heard any student, let alone a boy, want extra reading. Well, the ACLU went in and sued the school district because they said single-sex classes were, by definition, sexist. And they brought in some experts that claimed it was gender apartheid and on and on. And the school couldn't afford the lawsuit, so they stopped it. So that's a sort of, just mischief that's going on, worse than mischief. I mean, it's really harmful not to acknowledge that there's a difference. But anyway, it was to answer your original question, doesn't that mean there'd be special ways? Yes, there are some very ingenious ways to interest girls in math. And I think we should try them. And I also think we should have ingenious ways to interest boys in reading. But you have to admit there's a difference before you even bother, and we don't.
Mm-hmm. I hope we move to more computer-based education where it'll be able to individualize it for everybody.
That's where it has to go.
Mm-hmm.
And have master teachers. There are teachers that are geniuses at teaching boys, teachers that can reach the most disaffected, disengaged young man. And I'm thinking that the hope is to have more, cyber education, as you said.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate you being a guest on my show. Let me just ask you one final question. What's your prediction for what the campus climate's going to be like in 10 years? Do you think it could get a lot worse? It might get better?
I don't know, because I'm pessimistic in the sense that I don't see where the change can come from, because I've been in this for years. I mean, I was, as I said, I started criticizing it in the 80s. In the early 90s, we won the arguments, and we had the New York Times on our side then, and the New York Magazine and the New Yorker, and now not so much. So that's not good. And yet we still lost, because even though we won the argument, and I think we had the better positions, the other side quietly assumed all the assistant professorships. Mm-hmm. So they are there. And they're not going anywhere. Tenure, these ideas have tenure. So that makes me pessimistic. On the other hand, it can't go on. First of all, it's going to be too expensive to police the intimate lives and the conversations of the undergraduates. So they're going to have to keep growing the number and spending millions and millions of dollars on the gender projects, and then the classes are more and more esoteric and arcane and bizarre. How are people going? And it's getting more and more expensive, so it has to end. The bubble must burst. But so maybe the hope is cyber education. But still I believe in the college education. So I didn't answer your question. As you can see, I just don't know.